You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World, conversations with researchers and the path they've taken to help shape our everyday lives. Hi there, I'm Humera Iqbal and I'm a lecturer in psychology at the Thomas Coram Research Unit here at the UCL Institute of Education. Today, we're delighted to have Dr Amelia Roberts with us, who's a Principal Teaching Fellow at the Centre for Inclusive Education based at the Department of Psychology and Human Development at the IOE. Amelia's role at the Centre includes working internationally and with UK local authorities and school alliances to improve the attainment and participation of pupils with special educational needs and disabilities. She also leads on the knowledge exchange programme in social, emotional and mental health called Supporting Wellbeing, Emotional Resilience and Learning, which has been rolled out to over 55 schools since 2018. Amelia lived and worked in Hong Kong for 10 years before joining the Institute. Here she lectured in the psychology of education at Hong Kong City University. Her current research interests include knowledge exchange, exploring wider outcomes for vulnerable pupils, including looked after children, and in making autism research accessible to teachers. Today, we're going to talk to Amelia about her work in education and at the Centre for Inclusive Education. Welcome to the podcast, Amelia. It's lovely to have you. Thanks for being here. How are you?
Thank you, Humera. I'm great. Thank you, Humera. It's lovely to be here.
I have loads of questions to ask you, but I want to start by asking you, what made you want to study the psychology of education?
Oh, well, that's a great question. I was in Hong Kong and somebody mentioned that there was the opportunity to do a distance learning Masters of Education in Guidance and Counselling. And at the time, I was managing a centre for adults with intellectual disabilities, English-speaking adults in Hong Kong. So I took on this master's degree, absolutely loved it. And when I moved back to the UK, decided to do a PhD looking at how one supports teachers who are working within inclusive classrooms. So I started off really benefiting from master's level and research-led education. And that led me into wanting to become a researcher myself.
And can you tell me a bit more about what your PhD specifically focused on?
Yes, absolutely. I developed a meta-analytic framework which was based on activity theory, looking at the processes whereby teachers can utilize their professional development opportunities. So if you like, the burning question was, why is it that a teacher does a really fantastic piece of professional development, loves it, even tries out some of the strategies in her classroom, really enjoys the effects of that, and yet 6 months later she's not doing those strategies in her classroom. So I was really trying to work out why a teacher has such a great love of a particular type of teaching, a particular method or particular pedagogy, and yet the forces of the day-to-day school day, school week, school term, school year end up pushing out that great practice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, how did you go about researching it? Was it interviews or what did you do to learn more about this?
It was a combination of interviews, recorded focus groups, and lesson observations. And what I did is I worked within a school that I was at for an extended period of time anyway. So I wouldn't say it was ethnographic in a formal sense, but it was semi-ethnographic in the sense that I was there as part of the school community and able to collect very rich data as a result. And one of the things that I learned, and one piece of advice I would give to other researchers, is that if you're recording an interview or recording a conversation or recording a focus group, don't turn your recorder off when you think you're finished. Because when the technical bit or the formal bit is completed, quite often when people just go on talking, that's when you capture your real gems. So I absolutely advise, do not turn off that recorder.
That's a really great point. And it also probably applies to this new kind of research landscape that we're finding ourselves in, because we're being forced to do online interviews. And so, you're recording the interviews as well through Teams or other kind of sources. And you're right, the gems often come afterwards when people feel really relaxed about kind of what they're telling us.
I can give you a really great example, actually, of a head of maths who afterwards said, when I covered on maternity leave, I was teaching maths and I covered half the curriculum, but I covered it really well and the girls really learnt it. However, now I'm head of department, I could never do that. And that became central to my thesis about how the constructs of being in work sometimes prevent teachers from teaching in a way that they would really prefer to teach.
That's a great example. You also said that you use meta-analysis in your kind of methods or your PhD methods. Can you tell us what you mean by meta-analysis, and what were you analysing within this?
Yes, it actually was a meta-activity framework. So it wasn't a meta-analysis as a methodology.
Oh, I see.
What I was using, I was actually using Vygotsky's activity framework and looking at how, with mediated learning, there's a section or a space, if you like, where children are spending time on working with peers and problem solving and making sense of some learning, making sense of it in terms of relevance to themselves. So I took that meta activity framework and looked at how teachers themselves needed that kind of space in order to manage and understand their own professional development. So, if you like, the traditional model is you've had the input, now go away and do something with it in the classroom. And yet, when we think about children, we know that they need space to make sense of their learning and to think about how it's going to work for them in a way that makes sense to them. And so, what I was doing is I was taking the activity framework and turning it into a meta activity framework to look at how we offered teachers that same protected time and space in which they could integrate and make sense of their own learning.
I see. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I kind of also wanted to ask you about your time in Hong Kong, and how has that affected you as a researcher, and how did it affect your PhD research in a sense?
Yes, I came to academia relatively late in life. So by the time I got my PhD, I was 40. So before that, the time in Hong Kong was spent with vulnerable adults, with vulnerable children, with teachers. So I am really attuned to the needs of practitioners. And sometimes, certainly, when I'm
Mm.
around the incredibly erudite researchers in the Institute of Education, sometimes I can feel as if I'm not as high powered as them in terms of the extraordinary nature of their research. And we are surrounded by absolutely brilliant people. But having that practitioner background means that I feel very passionate about research can actually bring to practitioners and to the real world. And I think it's really important that academics and universities are thinking all the time about research impact and about how that actually works in real life. And I've got a really great example of that, actually. If we look particularly at the Institute of Education's work on group work and using ability groupings, the Institute's work is so powerful. You've got Becky Francis's work. You've got all the work from the Centre for Pedagogy that's run by Dominic Weiss, some absolutely wonderful research on the problems of ability groupings. So we know that it causes real difficulty. And yet, if you look at schools, schools are still harnessed to these ability groupings. They find it really difficult to do mixed ability groups. So, unless we can engage with schools and engage with practitioners on how we can support that change to happen, then the wonderful research is locked in one box, but the outdated practice in schools is locked in another box.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point because, as an academic, you kind of really, in a sense, need to be able to be a broker or translator of your research ideas into real life practice. But not everyone has had the kind of lived experience or kind of experience of working in the places in which they research in a sense. So I think I can really hear that, I can really sense that that's really brought a lot to your research, this experience that you've had. Was there kind of anything around cultural difference, or kind of has it made you attune to other aspects of kind of education, the move from Hong Kong to the UK?
It's made me listen to people really carefully. So when one has lived and worked in different cultures, it's so important to almost think about a Venn diagram of what you bring to the table and what other people bring to the table. And I feel very strongly that it's that bit in the middle where the real magic happens, if you like, where problems get solved. So it's enabled me, I think, to listen and hear what people need, what the difficulties are, and think about how we can move forward in solving those problems and work collaboratively in solving those problems. So when we talk about co-constructed research, or when we talk about knowledge exchange, for me, that's not lip service. It's the only way that we can truly progress in education.
That's a really great point. I'm going to come back to knowledge exchange in just a moment because you have so much experience in this realm. But before that, I'd like to ask you a bit about the UCL Centre for Inclusive Education. Can you tell me a bit about the work that the centre does and what's its remit?
Yes, absolutely. We mainly cover three core areas. So the first area is working on the accredited programs, and we run the National Award for SENCOs, which is a PG cert that is mandatory for SENCOs, but it's also part of the Masters in Special and Inclusive Education, or it can be part of that Masters if people choose to go on and do that program. We also run the Masters in Specific Learning Difficulties Dyslexia. So we have an accredited program route. We also do quite a lot of international work. So one of my projects has taken me to the Falkland Islands. Another one took me to work with UNICEF in the Sultanate of Oman. I recently did an evaluation of J.K. Rowling's charity, the Lumos Foundation, and that was in Moldova. So we do quite a lot of international work. And we also work on knowledge exchange school development programs, such as Making Autism Research Accessible to Teachers or Supporting Wellbeing, Emotional Resilience and Learning. We have another similar program that looks at spoken language in the classroom, which is very much based on Julie Dockrell's work and the work of her team. And we also do quite a lot of work around looked after children. Yeah, so lots of work within schools that really is based on knowledge exchange.
Lots of action oriented work by the sounds of it. But not everyone will know what knowledge exchange is. So, can you tell us what exactly do you mean by knowledge exchange?
Yes, there's a very good reason people don't always know what knowledge exchange is, and that's because there is no formally accepted definition. So, some people would consider knowledge exchange to be a focus group forum where people share ideas, and that, of course, can be a form of knowledge exchange. But we use it in a slightly more formal sense, which is that we take a body of research. So, we might do a scoping literature review. We then put that into a handbook or create some kind of audit whereby a school or an educational setting can examine their practice holistically against the evidence that's currently available. That then enables them to make a decision about an area of research that they want to undertake within their school. That may be action research, but it doesn't have to be. But they focus in on something that they want to change, and we support them in their research design and their data collection such that they can achieve some form of change within their school. But crucially, they then feed that back into the research community, hence knowledge exchange.
So, could you give me an example? You mentioned mixed ability group work before, but is there another example you could give me to help explain that further?
Yeah, I'm going to give you two examples actually, because the education examples are more challenging. If we think about knowledge exchange in a clearer way, UCL received quite a lot of news coverage because UCL researchers found a way to develop a ventilation system that supported patients with COVID-19. And that was a very classic example of knowledge exchange because you have the research, and that was able to go into the real world in discussion with medical practitioners and patients to form a product that benefited from both the real world practitioner and the researcher focus. So you can end up with a product that's the result of a knowledge exchange process. When it comes to knowledge exchange in education, it's a rather more complex process. So if I think about the SWERL project, we might talk about building relationships, or we might talk about pedagogies for inclusion. And then the school would take that and they would say, okay, we think the real problem with relationships in our school is that the midday supervisors don't understand how to de escalate children's stressed behaviour. So the children go back into the classroom, they're upset, it takes them a long time to settle down, and they're not accessing their learning for at least 20 minutes. And we're getting lots of behavioural instances in that space of time. So we are looking at something that's a little bit harder to quantify than a ventilation machine, but you've got a body of research that the schools benefit from, and they then, with our help, construct some kind of way of tackling this. So in this particular example, that way might be to think about restorative justice in their school, to think about how transitions are managed from the playground into the classroom, and then to think about how children are invited into learning via a starter activity that's engaging and based on pupil dialogue. So as I talk that through, I might be pointing to 5 or 6 or 10 different bodies of research that feed into something that makes a difference to that school, ending up in a case study that gets shared across schools and can be fed back into the research domain.
It's so important because, we're living in a society often where actually like evidence, empirical evidence and experts kind of knowledge is not always taken into account in a systematic way. So I can really kind of hear from your examples how it is very systematic and it is being used to kind of bring about change in a way that's backed up by evidence, in a sense, what we know from a range of studies. So, it's really important work. Can you just tell me a bit more in relation to knowledge exchange about SWERL and how that supports mental health and well-being in schools?
Yes, absolutely. SWERL is based on 7 different domains. And the reason we use domains is that it enables a school to look fairly easily across their whole school environment. So the 7 domains are supported and knowledgeable staff, the role of the teacher, which looks at what's going on in the classroom, the enabling environment, which looks at whether you've got spaces to meet different children's needs. Then there's whole system planning and design. And an example of that would be you might have a school that has a nurturing curriculum, but still has a very punitive and inflexible behaviour policy. So it's about looking at the whole school and whether the plans and policies are working together. Then you've got building relationships, and that could cover peer-to-peer relationships or teacher-pupil relationships or school and family relationships. But it's all about putting relationships at the heart of the school community. The 6th domain is robust communication systems, and it's about making sure that we are communicating, that we are listening. Pupil voice and parent voice might be a part of that, but they would also be a part of the other domains as well. And then the 7th domain is planned transitions, and that could be the transition from year 6 to year 7, or it could be micro transitions like the one that we just mentioned, from the playground back into classrooms. And we've worked with 55 schools now. And when we ask schools to look across all of those domains, it feels as if we are getting schools to have a really good look at what's going on and are able to make a really informed decision about an area of change that would really benefit the whole system.
So when you say 55 schools, is that specifically across the United Kingdom, or is that kind of internationally as well?
Yes, that's across the United Kingdom at the moment. But one of the advantages of COVID-19 is that it's really opened my eyes to what might be possible internationally. So we would certainly be interested in taking that forward. And just before lockdown, I won a small grant from the Public Engagement Centre in UCL, which was to take a SWERL workshop to Santiago. And I am very much hoping that that can still go ahead in the autumn.
Why Santiago?
It was to do with a collaboration between a university in Santiago and UCL. So I believe that the partnership was in existence and some money was released to make this possible. So yeah, so that's the reason. Although I have actually been to Santiago a couple of times on the way to the Falkland Islands, so very, very keen to go again.
I hope you make it there in a safe world. So you were saying something so interesting about the various domains, and say a school were to kind of carry out this audit, you might call it, and kind of identify that there was a particular domain that they needed to work on to kind of strengthen. What would be the next step for the school then?
Yes, they would then develop some kind of action plan. So they would distill their findings from the audit, and we really encourage them to do that as collaboratively as possible. So it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but after the first SWERL training, if a school comes to me at the end of that day and says, yep, we know exactly what we want to do, I'm actually less happy with that. I would be much happier with the school that says, do you know what? We've got so many ideas and so many thoughts. We really need to take it away and discuss it with all of our stakeholders to get a sense of where we really need to go. And sometimes schools do really lovely things, like they put up a sheet of A3 and give everybody post-it notes and say, what do you see when you walk around the school? So I love it when schools capture stakeholder data in a really creative way. From then, what they do is that they plan some kind of action. So it might be training or it might be rebuilding the playground. One school developed this incredible herb garden, and it sounds so simple, but they started off with herbs and then they looked at how the different herbs had an attribute for different types of emotions, and they linked that to an emotional well-being program. And so we were able to construct an element of research around that, whereby schools look at pupil confidence and pupil well-being before and after the programme has taken place. Some schools do work on staff confidence at maybe de-escalating difficult behaviour. Some schools look at curriculum and learning. Other schools do something absolutely gorgeous with a map of the school, and they ask children to place on the map where they felt sad, happy, uncomfortable, lonely, safe, unsafe. And then when they reworked the school environment, they redid that process and could see that children felt safer than they had previously. So basically, we help them to develop an action plan, and then we think about the data collection around that plan so they can gather evidence of the impact of what they've done.
That's absolutely fantastic. I love the example of the herb garden. And I mean, I really kind of, you said something earlier about space. And when children kind of do some work, they need some space to think and take it in. And it's the same for kind of schools and for academics, for adults as well. Like, space is what's so important, that time to think and process. And I think increasingly with all this knowledge that we're getting, it's really hard to actually to get that space. So I like all the examples you gave. It takes time to make decisions, doesn't it, about change, really.
It absolutely does.
Yeah, you also do some really interesting work around autism and kind of making autism research accessible to teachers. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about that research you do.
Yes, that is based on a slightly different model of knowledge exchange called learning communities, research learning communities. And what we do with that is we get groups of teachers together and we teach them research methods. So we link it to an assess, plan, do, review model because that's very much embedded in national policy. But we help them to think about the design of research much earlier than we do in SWERL. So the model is slightly different. And what we do is we introduce the teachers to research around autism in a way that's similar to SWERL. We help them to develop research around that. And schools have done amazing things. They've looked at communication systems. They've looked at using PECS in a different way. And PECS stands for a picture exchange communication system. Some of them look at zones of regulation, which is all about helping young people to manage and recognize and name their emotions. Some schools have looked at different ways of communicating. Other schools have looked at de-escalating stress or greater use of visual timetables. And quite often what happens is that a teacher in that session will come in and say, oh, yes, no, we use now and next cards, we use visual timetables. But when they dive further into the research, they realise that they're not actually using them consistently or regularly. So quite often, it's about really helping people to use theory robustly and to use resources in a really consistent manner, and therefore see much better results as a result of doing so.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It comes back to that point I was making before about being a mediator in a sense, because you're kind of translating knowledge and translating kind of all of this really sometimes often technically written research into a way that is kind of accessible for different groups. So I can really hear that from your work. So we spoke a bit about SWERL and how this new research, exciting research that you hope to carry out around internationally. And we talked about how the pandemic's affected that. But I wanted to ask you about how, COVID-19 has impacted on the well-being and education of children with special educational needs. Do you have any reflections on this?
Yes, indeed. There's been some very useful work carried out by Dr. Georgia Pavlopoulou, and she looked at families with autistic children. And she found there was a really mixed picture, with some families finding it very, very stressful. Some people with autism finding that the change to the routine has been really problematic for them. And children have felt that because they have to learn at home when home is not the place for learning, that concept has been really difficult to reinforce. At the same time, there have been other families with autistic children who report that their children have been much less anxious because they're not having to go outside quite as much. So you have a very, very mixed picture. And one of the things that we're seeing is that there's a very big gap between advantaged and disadvantaged young people. So if you're in a home with a garden and you've got great broadband access and you've got your own iPad, then you are far more likely to be able to access learning and be able to continue to be passionate about your learning. And we even see that disadvantage in terms of what schools are offering. So there's a piece of research done by the Sutton Trust, and it shows that schools in affluent areas are much more likely to do face-to-face teaching than schools in less affluent areas. So once again, the disadvantage stacks up for pupils. So we need to be quite careful in terms of thinking about how we support children in the transition back to school. Some children will have been in school, but others will be going back to school. And some children will need a great deal of support. So if you take a child with autism again, when they come back, the new measures might be really puzzling for them. They might find that the hand gel smells really strange, or they might find the new rules about lining up to be really difficult. So it's incredibly important that all the things that the research tells us about pupil voice in terms of discussing whether a type of detergent wipe would be better than the hand gel, or thinking about how we use social stories to explain what's happening, or about whether we use visual cues to explain the changes in rules. All of the research is there to support us in helping children with this kind of transition.
So I can really see how knowledge exchange would kind of help with this. And I imagine that, as you said, in the run up to children going back to school, knowledge exchange researchers are really busily looking at the data to see how they can assist schools with this.
There's been some good research in the Centre for Literacy, Mathematics and Language, which is part of the Psychology and Human Development Department, and they've just released a series of 6 videos, short videos, looking at how research can be supportive of schooling for families and schools. And one lovely piece of research from Dr. Chloe Marshall, in fact, Professor Chloe Marshall, looks at how using face masks can really be challenging for children with hearing impairment, particularly if they rely on lip reading. And so it really emphasises how important it is to use gestures, to talk more clearly, and to enunciate. So I do think that in this pandemic, research has never been more important in terms of helping people to think about how they're going to problem solve in the next months and years upcoming.
Amelia, a final question I had for you. Is there a particular thinker or researcher in the psychology of education or education studies that has really influenced your work? Or
What a fabulous question that is. Yes, my life was changed by Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers was around in the 60s, and he's probably best known for the work he did around counselling, particularly person-centered counselling or humanistic approaches. And in terms of counselling, what Carl Rogers said was that unconditional positive regard was the single most transformative thing you could do to help another human being. And unconditional positive regard is basically about genuinely liking somebody and conveying that liking to them. He then did some work on how that might look in schools. And there was a book called Freedom to Learn. And in Freedom to Learn, there is a chapter on congruence, and it's about teacher congruence. And basically, it's all about authenticity. And so what it is it's a very, very powerful, nuanced, very subtle look at how we bring our own person to teaching. So it's all about being able to be self-reflective, acknowledging perhaps that one feels irritated on a particular day and not to be blaming that irritation onto children. So that became the origin of child-centered learning or child-centered planning. But I think people have forgotten the origins, that actually it's all about authenticity. It's all about understanding yourself and understanding how you respond to other people. And it's all about building that relationship in the classroom. And for me, it's such a profound way of looking at relating with children and with other people in an education environment. And my life and research was changed by it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Carl Rogers' work I'm a big fan too. And I think, the point about authenticity, it's, as you say, it's not just, it's for education, but it's also for everyday life to really, kind of be mindful and check in. Thank you so much, Dr. Amelia Roberts. It was really fascinating and wonderful talking to you. And you've just done such an incredible range of different research topics. And what's really kind of impressive is how it's had meaningful impact in people's lives. So thank you so much for joining me today.
It's been a real pleasure. You are a fabulous interviewer. You really help somebody to, look very deeply into what they do. So I surprised myself with some of my answers. So, well done to you. Amazing questions.
Oh, that's so kind. And you're a fabulous person to interview because, you have so much knowledge. And I'm going to go back and look up Carl Rogers again because, yeah, you've inspired me a little bit there to go back to what I learned in my undergraduate. Thank you again.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
If you'd like to know more about Amelia, you can follow her on Twitter, Dr. Amelia Roberts. To learn more about the Centre for Inclusive Education, visit the IOE website and follow the Centre on Twitter, CIE_IOE. Remember, you can listen to the past 3 seasons of Research for the Real World and other podcasts from the IOE on your favourite podcasting app. Just search for IOE Podcast. And have a listen to our Spotify playlist of our guests and podcast team's favourite hits to get you through the lockdown. Just search Research for the Real World. I'm Humera Iqbal and see you again soon.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.